us in person. So good morning, Claire. Thank you for being with us. We've got you before the committee for 5 minutes this morning, so I'll hand over to you to begin your presentation.
Morena, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Ngāti whakau e Ngāpuhi tainoi me tu wharatua o ku iwi. I'm a professor of law with a doctorate from Cambridge University in comparative constitutional law and international law on Indigenous people's rights, with over 100 publications in the area. I'm co-director of the New Zealand Centre for Indigenous Peoples and Law, and I presented and taught in this area for decades at many universities, including Oxford, Harvard, Toronto and Columbia. I'm the former rongomai takitaki at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, and I've held many positions at the United Nations, including most recently as advisor to the President of the General Assembly. There's been considerable and dangerous misinformation shared and woeful ignorance expressed about New Zealand's global standing and protection of Indigenous people's rights. Equally, Māori rights have been portrayed as undemocratic and creating inequality for non-Māori, when international consensus within Western liberal democratic states and international law, the exact opposite is true. This bill would be constitutionally invalid in both the United States and Canada and is in breach of New Zealand's obligations under international law. Here, Te Tiriti o Waitangi is not enforceable, except in the limited cases where Parliament has included its principles in legislation. Any subsequent legislation contrary to Te Tiriti principles takes precedence over earlier legislation. In the US, treaties between Indigenous peoples and the United States are explicitly protected under the US Constitution. They are legally enforceable. They have the same status as federal legislation. This means, for example, that they override state laws. The US Supreme Court has consistently upheld American Indian treaty rights, including, for example, the right to 50% of the fishing take in areas in Washington state covered by treaty, and very recently, by a relatively conservative court, to lawmaking power over large areas of Oklahoma, including Tulsa, a city of over 1 million people. That's how seriously they take their treaty obligations. American Indians' tino rangatiratanga is expressed as inherent sovereignty under law in the US and is protected in hundreds of years of constitutional law. Almost 600 American Indians peoples govern themselves with their own governments and courts. The argument that American Indian rights violate non-Indians' right to freedom from racial discrimination, in other words, are a privilege to American Indians, has been resoundingly rejected by the US Supreme Court. The court has held that American Indians are not a racial group. Instead, they are sovereign peoples. The federal government owes, under law, American Indians trust obligations. The Canadian Constitution entrenches First Nations treaty and Aboriginal rights, including Aboriginal title, as higher law. This means they override inconsistent federal and provincial legislation. They take precedence over individuals' rights, also as expressly stated in the Constitution, including over the right to non-discrimination on the grounds of race. Indigenous peoples' collective rights trump. In case law, the Canadian Supreme Court has stated that this provision is consonant with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canada has enacted progressive federal law to give effect to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the right to self-determination. Their settlement processes centre on expanding Indigenous peoples' territory and lawmaking power, independent of the state, over those areas. I mentioned also Sami parliaments in Scandinavia and efforts in Latin America to recognise Indigenous people's self-determination. This bill, and indeed New Zealand's basic constitutional structure and approach, is in breach of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and particularly under Article 37 of the Declaration, which states that the obligation to honour and respect these treaties and declarations. The United Nations' pinnacle human rights body, the Human Rights Council, has effectively reprimanded New Zealand for failing to do that and made comments that there needs to be appropriate constitutional processes to recognise Te Tiriti o Waitangi. New Zealand has also been criticised by the UN Committee on Racial Discrimination for its approach to special rights. Global experts then on racial discrimination do not believe Indigenous people's rights are discriminatory. In conclusion, contrary to the outright misinformation expressed by politicians driving this bill, New Zealand is already woefully behind internationally in respect for Indigenous people's rights and to the enforcement of our treaties. This bill seriously aggravates this embarrassing situation and must be abandoned.
Thank you, Claire. That's the 5 minutes. We do have a bit of time to run over. We've got some shuffling around in the program. So if anyone has any questions for Claire, particularly given her background and expertise in the subject, Adrian.
Kia ora. I just wanted to ask, if not this bill, then what could New Zealand do to actually implement rights under Te Tiriti properly?
I think one of the first steps would be to, like Canada just recently, to enact law to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a way to realise our rights under Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
Thank you, Adrian. Hannah Linden.
Yeah, it's similar vein to Tamata Adrian, but really wanting to explore your thoughts around, what is the solution to what we're currently facing with the Treaty Principles Bill conversation in New Zealand now, while not undermining any further our rights as tangata whenua through Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
I think substantive and substantial constitutional transformation is required to realise our rights and to come even close to similar standards set by the United States and Canada as two examples. So I think that we need, as mentioned, to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We should do something akin to, we have to have our own answers, the entrenchment of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi in our legal system as higher law. That would be the kind of thing that I think that we need to do, drawing on experiences elsewhere. But we need as a nation to think about that, but we certainly need to make sure to measure up to our Western liberal democratic partners to do something pretty substantive.
Okay, we'll go to a final question from Todd Stevenson.
Thank you for your submission. I just want to make sure I understood you properly. Are you saying that our current governance arrangements with the New Zealand Parliament is kind of illegitimate or inappropriate? Is that what you were saying?
I mean, I think that's not what the point that I've made, but I would agree with that point. I think people have made that point elsewhere. I'm saying that it's embarrassing that New Zealand is so woefully behind in its protection of Indigenous people's rights, particularly when we compare ourselves to our neighbours, our Western liberal democratic states. I think, absurd and embarrassing.
Thank you, members, for the questions. Thank you, Claire, for your time this morning and for being with us. We do appreciate that submission.
Thank you. Kia ora.
We'll go to our submission now.
Okay. I will admit I'm not too familiar with how legislation is set up in America or Canada when it comes to Indigenous peoples. I'm sorry, that's not the scope of my knowledge. When it comes to, I mean, it's very interesting, his submission. I would have loved more specific examples of how we are behind Canada and America. I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm as a woke person. I'm even surprised the Supreme Court in America even knows what Native Americans are. By the way, how their country is operating. And then we look at instances like Standing Rock. It's like, oh, they exist. Yeah, so it is interesting that Native Americans in the United States are viewed as sovereign. Yeah, it's really interesting when you look at their history and you look at the way how they've kind of been, pushed to the side by previous governments in America, by Congress. Like, they're not really given much in terms of support. Definitely not in the area of public health. I know that much.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't really have much commentary about this because I'm not awfully familiar with how Indigenous people are treated in Canada, and I just know that Indigenous people in America are treated like shit. But apart from that, I can't point to any specific legislation.
Yeah, no, neither. I do remember seeing a video from a fantastic Indigenous American woman. I can't remember her name right now. It'll come to me. But she was talking about how they were all pushed into reserves.
Yep.
And given that little plot of land, and now the common myth around them is that they are so rich and so well off because of their casinos, and they're actually not.
I don't see much wealth. I mean, all I see there with the Native Americans is a prime example of capitalism. I don't see much in terms of wealth trickling into the reserves. I mean, I see reserves that are just, people are really poor.
Yeah.
That's what I see.
The
when I see a
majority,
reserve.
There are some Indigenous American tribes that have done well for themselves because of their casinos, but the majority of them aren't.
And that's going to vary from. That's also going to vary from state to state about what the casino laws are, and there might be an area where people don't want to go to a casino. I don't know. It's like I don't know what the economics of running a casino in America is. All I know is that Trump went bankrupt a couple of times trying to run casinos.
Yes, but yeah, there's a lot of tribes that are in America that are worse off than our iwi and our hapu.
Yeah, I mean, all I know is that the people that are running the casinos, the Native Americans, maybe they would be better off in charge of the American economy right now than the failed casino owner being Trump. I'm just going to be real there. If they're still operating and going and Trump's like, no. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear which guys we should put in charge.
Yeah. Absolutely. The ones that actually care about the land and the environment and the people that it holds.
Yeah.
Just maybe.
Alrighty, next submission before I say anything that's misleading.
From
about
Justin Connolly. People. Justin is joining us online.
Thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed to our Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Instagram, TikTok, News Scout, the Order Paper Podcast.